Hey, what's going on guys? Welcome back to another video. So in this video, we're going over movement number 3, which is the forward fold. Now when it comes to the forward fold, the main muscle group that we're focusing on are the hamstrings, and especially in the upper hamstrings. And you'll see in the stretches that we're going to be covering today, a large portion of the stretches will be targeting those upper hamstring muscles. And one exercise that focuses on the sciatic nerve that runs down through the entire leg. One of the reasons why the hamstring muscles are quite tight in the West is because we spend a large portion of our time running in the gym or outside. So this is where most of the tightness comes from. So why is this then? Well, when we look at the biomechanics of running, for a large portion of us in the West, our legs tend to swing side to side, and that is as a result of having really bad gait. What is gait? Well, gait is the way you walk, the biomechanics of walking. And if your feet are pronated, or you generally tend to have flat-footed feet, what will happen is your gait will be massively affected. So your legs at the knees will swing side to side as opposed to walking in a straight motion. So that is attributed to having tight hip flexor muscles. When there is restriction in the hip and the hip is not able to go into that extended position, what usually happens is the stress is put onto the outer hamstring, and it's the outer hamstring that drives that hip backwards and then forward again, which again, that should be taken on the hip flexor muscles and not in the outer hamstrings, which further exacerbates the tightness in the hamstring muscles. So how do we resolve this issue when we're running? Well, number one is to open up the hip flexor muscles. I've created stretches in my previous videos that you can check out that will help you do that. And number two is work on stretches to open up the hamstring muscles. Now, depending on where you have the tightness in the hamstrings, so you may have it in the upper hamstrings or the lower hamstrings, this will determine which stretch will be effective for you. Now, before you start working on these hamstring stretches, I would definitely recommend testing out your forward fold, see how it is currently, and then once you perform these stretches, retest the forward fold and see how you do. The other thing is, there's a small disclaimer before we get into these stretches. When it comes to stretching your hamstrings, you are going to feel quite sore for at least a couple of days, maybe up to a week. So please go very slowly with this, and I would definitely recommend doing one session a week. To start off, and then as you become more competent and the muscles start to become used to the intensity of being stretched, then you can increase the number of sessions that you're doing per week. And a good way to start off is maybe for the first month or 2 months, focus on one session a week, and then just test out how much DOMs you get the next day, or especially 72 hours later, and then reevaluate and see if you can increase the volume of sessions per week. Oh, and one more thing before I completely forget. Make sure you are stretching off your calves before you are doing any hamstring stretches, because the sciatic nerve runs down all the way to the bottom of the foot. The calf is a major restriction when it comes to hamstring flexibility too. So what you could do is use the calf stretches that I suggested from the previous video, plus couple that with the squat prep that I also mentioned in the previous video too. That is a great way to warm up the muscles around the hips and the legs before you get into the hamstring stretches. Okay, so that's the last of the last minute interruptions. Let's get straight into these stretches. Stretch number 1 are the elephant walks. Now, these are great for warming up the hamstrings before you go into any deep hamstring stretches. So to get into position, we're going to place our feet hip width apart. Then we're going to place our hands on our knees or our thighs, and we're going to use them as support. You're going to fold at the hip, and we're going to try and get our belly to rest on our thighs when we're doing this. Then you can take away the hands and place them on the ground. If you feel as though you're struggling to get the hands on the ground, feel free to also elevate the hands. So place a pair of yoga blocks or a couple of books stacked up, and you're going to rest your hands on top of the object. Now, when it comes to the forward fold, you just want to make sure that you're bending as much as you need to at the knees, just to make sure that your belly is resting against your thighs. And then to get the elephant walks going, what we're going to do is we're going to bend both knees, and then you're going to twist your torso to one side, and then you're going to try and straighten that leg as much as possible without losing the contact between your thigh and your rib cage. So it's just the smallest amount of straightening of the knees, and that should invoke a stretch in the upper hamstrings. From that position, you're just going to bend at the knees and bring your torso back into the center, and then you're going to do the same thing again on the opposite side. So you're going to bend at the knees and then straighten towards the other side, making sure that you're still maintaining contact between the rib cage and the thighs. So all we're doing with the elephant walks is we're performing gentle pulses in and out of the movement, so we're getting a nice stretch in the hamstring muscles. Try and go gentle with this movement. Remember that we're just warming up the hamstrings, so we don't want to perform anything too strenuous when we're doing the elephant walks. But the amazing thing about the elephant walks are that you're going to make a large portion of your gains, especially if you're super tight in the hamstring muscles, just by spending most of your time performing the elephant walks. So what separates the elephant walks from the typical forward fold that you would do with your legs straight is that when you bend at the knees, you actually focus the stretch in the hamstrings as opposed to keeping those legs straight and focusing the majority of the stretch in the lower back. So this is why this movement is great for releasing the tension in the hamstrings. Feel free to perform as many repetitions as you want. And then once you're done, we're going to reverse the movement to get out of position. So you're going to bring your hands back to your knees or your thighs. And then you're going to press away and lift your chest away from your thighs. If you have any issues performing this movement, feel free to refer to my favorite mentor, Kit Lachlan, and he's got a lot more theory behind why these are so great for us. Stretch number 2 is the child pose. So we're going to move our focus away from the hamstring muscles for a second and work on the lower back muscles. So when it comes to the forward fold, like I mentioned at the start, the majority of the tension is in the hamstring, but also a lot of people have restriction in the lower back muscles, especially in the quadratus lumborum, which are the muscles that run down the side of your back. So for those of you that are familiar with the child pose from yoga, this is exactly the same movement, and then at the end I'll show you a different variation of the same movement, but just with a straddle. So to get into position, we're going to place our knees on the ground and we're just going to sit down on our heels. And then we're going to try and get our chest to rest on our knees. So when you're going into position, take your time with this, and also if you feel as though you've got discomfort in the knees or you're feeling any sort of pain in the knees, feel free to place a bolster or rolled up yoga mat or even a cushion underneath the gap between your bottom and your heels. So then that way we're resting our bottom on that object and then we're not putting so much pressure on compressing the knees. And if you feel as though you're struggling to get your knees to your chest, feel free to place an object to rest your chest on and place it on your knees. We can also do this movement without placing our chest on our knees by resting on our forearms as well. So there are many ways of going into the child pose. It's all dependent on where your tightness is and how comfortable you are going into the movement. So in terms of duration, try and spend about 2 to 3 minutes in this pose. And the more you rest and get that belly to soften, the more you'll feel that stretch in your lower back. If you're quite flexible, this movement will probably not be that beneficial to you, but it's a great way just to give your lower back muscles a nice little stretch. And then from here, we're going to perform a small little variation. We're going to perform the child pose using a straddle variation. So what you're basically doing here is you're separating the knees and you're going to try and rest in between your knees. Now this variation is definitely more intense, so really do take your time with this, and also feel free to introduce an object so that you're resting your belly on something, and that way that should increase the comfort or reduce the intensity of the stretch. So the difference between the normal child pose and the straddle child pose is that when we perform the straddle, we're working on that anterior pelvic tilt or just that pelvic tilt movement in the hips. So what you'll notice is when I'm going into the straddle child pose, I'm trying to get my back as flat as possible and I'm thinking about shooting my bum out to perform that anterior pelvic tilt. And the second thing is the straddle child pose is very similar to the pancake movement. The only difference is your legs are straight when you're doing the pancake, whereas this one we're bending at the knees. Also feel free to place an object underneath your bottom to rest on if you feel as though you can't get your bottom to the ground with your feet right next to your bottom. And again, like I did with the normal child pose, you can also rest your forearms on the ground as the first target to aim for. And then as you become more flexible, walk your hands forward and try and get your chest closer to the ground. And again, like I mentioned in the child pose, we're trying to get that belly as soft as possible. The softer the belly is, the more relaxed you'll feel in position. Stretch number 3 are the straddle elephant walks. So we're going to go back into the hamstring stretches again, and this time round we're going to perform a straddle variation of the elephant walk. So in terms of positioning, we just want to keep our feet just slightly outside of hip width apart. So we're going into a semi-straddle. We don't want to go too wide with our straddle at the start because we want to focus the stretch purely on the hamstring muscles and not in the hip tilting movement. So the first thing you're going to do to get into position is place your hands on the outside of your heels, if you're flexible enough to do that. If you aren't, feel free to place your hands on the ground in front of you or next to your head. And also, like I mentioned in the normal elephant walks, feel free to elevate your hands as well. So place some yoga blocks or a pair of books in front of you as well. Also, like the normal variation of the elephant walks, we want to get our belly to rest on our thighs, but because we're in a straddle, we want the belly to be in between our thighs as much as possible. Next, we're going to just bend at the knees and we're going to straighten our legs as much as possible without pushing the belly too far away and creating rounding in the back. So you're going to bend both knees at the same time and straighten at the same time as well. You're going to do this for a couple of repetitions and then we're going to switch up the variation and we're going to perform a mini Cossack. So what we're doing here is we are straightening one side and bending the other side. So straighten one leg and bend the other one. Don't worry if your back starts to round. The focus is just to try and get one of your legs to straighten as much as possible. You're going to do the same thing on the opposite side and we're just going to alternate again, performing pulses on both sides. The next variation is the actual straddle elephant walks. So with this straddle variation, we want to mimic the same movement in our knees. So we're bending the knees and then we're only straightening so much so that we feel a stretch in the upper hamstrings. So try not to lock your knees out when you're doing this. And then that way you're getting more benefit in the actual stretch itself. And then finally, we're going to go into a standing pancake. So this time round, we want to try and straighten our back as much as possible. Again, going into that anterior pelvic tilt if we're going to perform a pancake on the ground. So we're hinging at the hip and we're going to tip that jug forward and stick that bum out. And the way I like to do this is to grab the back of my heels and then that way I'm pulling my chest closer to the ground. So if you've got the flexibility to do that, feel free to do that. Or what you could do is grab the calves. Or again, like we did in the previous one, maybe place your hands on the ground or on an elevated surface. So a couple of things to note when you're performing these stretches. Number one is to make sure that before you switch from one variation to the next variation, that you're giving yourself a couple of seconds rest. So you're shaking your legs off, maybe go for a walk and then go back into position. And number two is to make sure the intensity is tolerable enough that you can hold it for anything between 1.5 minutes and 2 minutes. So again, go to that range of between 50% and 70%, which tends to be the ideal range. And finally, stretch number 4 is the wall downward dog. Now I found this variation of the downward dog extremely interesting. So the difference between the normal downward dog and the wall variation is that if you perform the normal downward dog and you've got someone pressing down on the hips in front of you, you notice that you get a stronger stretch in the upper hamstrings, and especially it works on the sciatic nerve that runs down the entire leg. And I've also had my own personal experience when it comes to releasing the tension in the sciatic nerve. What I realized is when I was doing my pancake stretches, no matter how much I opened up my hamstrings, I just couldn't get my hip to fully tip forward. I got it to a certain degree, but to get to that final range where your belly is on the ground and your back is still flat, I realized that it was the sciatic nerve that was holding me back. And I listened to a Kit Locklin podcast and he mentioned that when it comes to the textbook version of the downward dog, most people really struggle to get that pelvis to tip forward and to get the bum to shoot out when they go into the downward dog. And also a lot of people generally have their heels off the ground. So to get that textbook version of the downward dog, you need to make sure that heel is placed on the ground. And he says that your feet should be no more than about 10 inches apart. If they're wider than that, then you're not really focusing the stretch on those upper hamstrings and especially in that sciatic nerve. So to get into position, all we're going to do is we're going to place our back against the wall. Keep your feet again anything between a foot or 10 inches apart. And then what we want to do is rest our palms on the ground. So then that way we're supporting our weight on our palms. Don't worry too much if your back is rounding. Our focus is mainly to get our legs as straight as possible and then also to create that anterior pelvic tilt. So imagine that you're trying to shoot your bum out as much as possible. Make sure those heels are on the ground and then you're just going to try and rest in that position. And the focus is in that anterior pelvic tilt. So by shooting that bum out, you're going to get that really strong stretch or that sensation in the upper hamstrings and running down in the sciatic nerve. Now, when you're performing this stretch, make sure the focus is on the hips. What you'll notice is the hip will want to tuck again. So again, make sure you're shooting your bum out and you're straightening the back as much as possible. So then that way we're really concentrating the stretch in the upper hamstrings. We're going to hold this for anything between 2 to 3 minutes again. If you're struggling to hold this duration, ease off by walking your feet further back. Or what you can also do is lift the back slightly higher up from the wall. A small little variation you can do when you're performing the downward dog is perform it with a single leg. So take one leg out of the way, and what you want to do is you want to try and lift the leg up and try and straighten it as much as possible. Also pay attention to the positioning of your hips. We want to make sure that the hips are square to get the maximum benefit of this stretch. So bring one hip down and level them out. So the benefit of doing the single leg variation is that it will focus the stretch exclusively on one hamstring or on one side. And then that way you can also correct the imbalances you have in the hamstring flexibility in your body. So that's pretty much it for this video. Now what you want to do, like I said at the start of this video, is perform the forward fold, then perform the stretches, and then retest your forward fold, and then just see how much flexibility you've gained just by doing these stretches. Stay consistent with these stretches, and also make sure that you are recording your progress, or you're tracking your progress. That way you can actually see the incremental increases in flexibility. Thank you so much for watching. As usual, if you've got any questions, drop them down below in that comment section. Hit that like button and hit that subscribe button. I shall see you in the next one.